What if the real horror of time travel isn't changing the past, but being forced to relive it? In today's episode, we delve into the haunting mind of Philip Fracassi, author of the gripping new novel, The Third Rule of Time Travel. We explore how he blends psychological horror with theoretical physics, crafting a story where trust is fragile, memory is a weapon, and science is anything but safe. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Philip Fracassi. All right, friends and familiars, we are live on YouTube, Twitch, Trovo, and Facebook with Philip Fracassi here to discuss his new novel, The Third Rule of Time Travel. Philip, welcome to the show.
Hey, Vince. Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. It's fun to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining me on this 21st day of March 2025. I came across your work on Bookstagram along with a glowing endorsement from Ronald Mouthy, so I was thrilled to find out that you were about to release a new novel that was right up my alley in terms of content. The book is packed with psychological horror, thrills, and techno-dystopia, blended with quantum physics and the compelling, unsettling truth of how bizarre the world is and how little we actually know about it. So, thank you for coming on the show today to discuss this incredible work.
Yeah, man. Thank you. It's nice to hear that you heard about me via Malfi. He's a buddy of mine, and he's my sort of my drinking buddy in the author world. So I'm glad that he said something nice about me. It's a rarity for him. And that's a joke. That's a joke.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it could be just a drinking buddy. I know it's pretty common with a drinking buddy to just sit there and talk shit back and forth.
Yeah, we do. He does a lot of that. He likes to, whenever we get in public together, which we're going to be together at AuthorCon in about a week, we're going to be doing a reading together. And he likes to try and embarrass me in public as much as possible. So he's sort of that brother from another mother. Likes to try and get under my skin, but it never works.
Gotcha. Works. Well, kind of give a brief little synopsis of the book. It's about a woman named Beth who, along with her husband, had begun to work on the prospect of time travel. Because they were having difficulty finding funding for it, they found themselves under the employment and financial blanket of a company called Langan Corp, or Langan Corp, I guess I should say. A shadowy private organization housed in a large, mostly underground compound that is highly compartmentalized and guarded by a private security force reminiscent of Blackwater. Tragically, Beth's husband Coulson dies, leaving her to oversee the project on her own while also raising their young daughter, Isabella. But after a few voluntary and some forced sessions on the machine, she begins to see and hear strange things. This starts to worry the medical team tasked with monitoring her health and her best friend, and that is where the story begins. So, to give a little context, the type of time travel we're talking about isn't the fantastical variety you find in movies, but rather the travel of human consciousness back in time to specific moments in a person's life via the opening of a wormhole. The traveler can only observe, having no influence on the past that could affect the present. There's something haunting about being able to witness your past but not change it. So, what emotional or philosophical questions were you hoping to explore with that idea?
I mean, yeah, you nailed it. It is kind of a haunting idea of being able to travel to a point in your own past, and to simply to re-experience that moment in time and not be able to do anything to change it or change the consequences of that moment. And what happens with Beth, Dr. Darlow, in the book, is that she ends up traveling to some moments that are pivotal in her life and tragic. And I think when I first came up with the idea, there was a scene that popped in my head, and I was like, what if you were able to travel back in time to a moment that could save somebody that you dearly loved, and all you could do was re-experience it and not change it? The emotional turmoil of that experience I just felt was so powerful. And so that was kind of one of the main things that drives the story is this idea of re-experiencing these pivotal moments in your life and not being able to change them. Unlike, to your point, in traditional time travel stories, you can step on a butterfly or kill your grandfather. And the whole point of this particular story is that you can't do anything to change the past or the future. I thought that had its own kind of drama, and I thought it was a little bit of a different approach to the trope of time travel and the genre in general.
Yeah, I really like the scaling down of it to where it's not, I mean, there are a lot of fantastical elements, and we'll get to it later. It's based on some actual solid quantum physics, but scaled down to where it's a little fantastical, but it's not really that far off from the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the idea with this book is that it's a very human story, that it's a very grounded story. This is not, like I said, this is not dinosaurs and dystopia. This is about real people going through something very emotionally charged and psychologically problematic, we'll say. And, and also the way these experiences change who you are as a person and who you become as a person. Yeah. So that was definitely the idea of keeping it very grounded and very much on a human level. Although, to your point, there are definitely some fantastical elements and speculative elements that end up getting interjected into the hard science of it all.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things Beth is faced with is the firing of a scientist named Jerry who works for the company on another project and is forcibly removed by security. She finds out from one of her coworkers that Jerry's entire project is being shut down. So, what effect did you intend for this tense moment to have on the reader right off the bat to set the tone for the story?
Yeah. So Jerry was an interesting character. He originally was only in the book for a few pages, but people seem to really like Jerry and his disruptive nature. So he ended up getting a little more screen time, as it were. But yeah, the idea was to start planting a seed for the reader that all is not well at Langan Corp. And, the reader's kind of finding out real time along with Beth that there's something going on with the company that she's not aware of, and that is potentially going to directly impact her project. And so, yeah, so Jerry is a disruptor. Jerry is there to tell the reader, hey, things are not going great. There's something going on that you don't know about. And you and Beth are going to have to find out together what that is and how it will affect her, her character and her ability to continue working on this invention that her and her husband had created. So that was the idea with Jerry, is just kind of, well, I would say the opening of the book, which takes place with Beth traveling, is probably the first indication that that things are probably not going to go super well for Beth in this book. And then I think with Jerry, it's sort of like your second pinch, as it were, to let you know that there's something going on and things are not necessarily going as well as Beth would like them to.
Yeah, for me, the initial scene with Jerry is kind of like a pebble in your shoe, like, I mean, obviously, as things progress, a lot more nefarious things start kind of coming into play. But initially, it's like, oh, all right, well, I'm just going to file that to the back of my, of my mind. But Beth has a coworker named Tariq who works with her in the lab. And Tariq is difficult to read. It's unclear whether he's a friend or an opportunist biding his time. Unfortunately, she has to trust him due to the fact that he's the one at the controls while she's helpless on the time travel machine. There's an interesting tension in the fact that Beth has to trust someone she's unsure about while she's at her most vulnerable. I mean, strapped down, unconscious, literally in another world. So, what did you want to explore with that relationship?
I think the idea with Tariq is the fact that he is somewhat of an unknown card. He's sort of a wild card in the story. And what I tried to get across using elements of backstory to a degree and becomes more clear at the end, near the end of the story. But as I try to get across that, Tariq was never really Beth's guy. He was always kind of Coulson's guy and Beth's husband who passed away. So the idea is for people listening, Beth and Coulson developed this technology together. It's their invention. And then when Coulson dies, Beth has to go on her own to continue the thing. And meanwhile, a lot of her staff gets cut away by the CEO of Langan Corp because they have to cut back on her funding. And so she's kind of having to do everything herself with just this one assistant. So she's without him, she's really screwed. She has to have somebody there to help her do, the work of 10 people. And so yeah, to your point, she has no choice but to trust him. But he does things that lead her to believe that he is untrustworthy. The characters in the story are all very conflict heavy, and you never really know for sure who's a friend and who's a foe. And I liked that the reader kind of finds out, like I mentioned earlier, real time along with Beth, how much she can trust these different characters, these different people in her life, and which ones are ultimately going to help her or ruin her. And so that's kind of part of the tension of the story, is that you don't know as the reader, because Beth doesn't know, you don't really know who to trust. And so that with Tariq was sort of one example, along with Jonathan, who plays the psychiatrist, and even Jim, the CEO, is a little more obviously not an ally, but at the same time, he's also that position where he's almost someone who I don't want to say like a godlike figure, but he's almost this representation of her goal. Her goal is to finish the machine and to finally figure out how the machine works and to get it to work the way she wants it to and to fully understand it. So all the different characters, they all have sort of their positives and negatives. And Tariq was just, like I said, that one example of like, can you trust this guy? And how frightening is it for someone like Beth not to be able to trust someone, to your point, who she's relying so heavily on? And so creating that tension was important to me.
Yeah, he definitely, I'm pretty sure he says it himself at one point. He's definitely omniscient when it comes to, as far as being God is concerned.
Oh, Jim? Yeah, Jim
Yeah.
Langan. Yeah, yes. Which is another, right. 'Cause there's a couple of moments in that book where I definitely kind of try and hammer home like what his representation is in this world. And he's godlike, we'll say. He's not supposed to be God necessarily, but he's certainly godlike. And whether that's for good or for bad is to be determined.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a natural explanation for him being omniscient.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the periods of her life that the machine is dropping Beth into are horrific. How did you approach writing those dark, emotionally intense scenes? Were any of them particularly difficult to write?
Well, when I first came up with the idea for the book and the idea that I mentioned at the beginning about the idea of reliving a moment in your life and not being able to change it, when I first came up with that concept for the story, two of those travel scenes sprang into my head right away. The scene that opens the book in the airplane, and the scene with Coulson in the laboratory when he leaves and she can't stop him from leaving. And so, I'm traditionally known more as a horror writer. Most my other novels are pretty much horror. And when I wrote this book, I wasn't really thinking about it as being science fiction. I was really thinking about it as just another horror novel. But as I got more into it and got more into the technology aspects and the science aspects and all that stuff, I really got kind of excited about creating this machine and how does the machine work. And so it became sort of more sci-fi as I dug deeper into all the technology and quantum mechanics of it. And so anyway, but point is that because I was writing in my head as a horror story, or at least a story that could be classified as horror, those darker scenes, were very natural to me. And I tend to just write dark material anyway. That's like my wheelhouse. But I really wanted the reader to experience what Beth was experiencing. And I think you have to get very visceral and you have to really try and put the reader there visually so that they can feel every impact and they can feel every emotion as best as I'm able to do it anyway. So they were not difficult for me to write. Matter of fact, those scenes are probably the easier portions of the book to write because, like I said, it is sort of my wheelhouse to write darker material. And it was really fun to write those moments. There is a scene, which I don't want to get into spoilers, right? But one of the travel scenes that happens, that's sort of a big turning point in the book. That was a difficult scene to write. It was difficult to put Beth through that for me because it's such a pivotal moment in the story. That was hard to write. So you understand what I'm talking about, to the hospital scene. That was difficult. I would say of all the scenes in the book that made me the most squeamish, that was probably the one that hit the hardest.
Gotcha. Well, because of the intense effect time travel has on the psyche in the story, Beth is required to not only undergo debriefings after each trip, but also to speak with a therapist once a week and be evaluated by a physician once a month. The regular debriefings and evaluations create a kind of clinical tension. So, did you draw inspiration from real world programs, whether that be military, psychological, or scientific for this structure?
So the medical stuff with Beth, was it inspired by anything?
Yeah, is it like military, psychological, or scientific?
No, I think I really wanted to get across the idea that it's almost like a professional athlete. Beth is Jim's like golden ticket. Jim Langan, the CEO. Like she's this brilliant scientist, but he's also willing to punish her in ways that are potentially corruptible to her. And there's a balance with him, like how hard do I push her? And that we're at one point in the story, he wants to start pulling back on how much she is doing as it pertains to traveling, because it seems to be messing with her. And then Beth not wanting to relinquish that control. So there's a lot of tugging, push and pull with her health and her safety. And so I think with the idea with the doctors and the psychologists is basically me creating this kind of, you said it really well, a very clinical environment where Beth is, I don't know what the right word is. It's not coming to my mind. It's not a guinea pig, but where Beth is basically this tool, and that Jim needs to keep like in good shape, in good condition and aligned. And so I really wanted to get across that she's very much a tool for Langan Corp, and one that he's gone through great expenses to make sure that she stays, upright, and that she stays both emotionally, psychologically, and physically well enough to continue doing what she's doing. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was really inspired by anything other than me wanting to make sure to get that element across, that she doesn't work in a flower shop. She doesn't work in a normal corporate environment. And you said, the military, it is almost militaristic. And you mentioned Blackwater and stuff like that. Very much so. Like this is definitely one of those black, labs or whatever, black laboratories or black sites, whatever, where like there are things going on that are being funded by this corporation that are very much potentially tools of war and potentially dangerous to civilization. But so it's, you kind of get the idea that he's operating. I never addressed this in the book, and now I kind of wish I had, but sometimes you get the sense that he's sort of maybe even aligned with the government in as far as what he's doing. And you kind of have this mysterious board who's sort of like overseeing the whole thing. So that was the idea with creating like the psychologist and the questions and the doctors that are surrounding Beth all the time, is definitely so that the reader understands this is not a normal work environment. This is a very serious place. And that's why I also spent a lot of time, like even with Jerry, who we talked about, these are not normal security guards. These are more like Blackwater type military guards who enforce and who secure Langan Corp, and all the things that are going on there. And I even mentioned in one part of the book where Beth really doesn't have a good idea of what all these other departments are doing. And she's sort of on her own, need to know basis. And she's kind of just goes in to the building and goes to her lab. And that's pretty much all she gets to really see. And you kind of get a sense that there's more going on when she meets with Jerry later. You get a sense of like, there are other top secret things being developed in this place that she's not privy to. So I definitely wanted to give it a very militaristic vibe and almost like a Pentagon-y type vibe. But again, I also wanted to get across that Beth is nothing more than a tool to this company and a tool that they badly need to work.
Yeah, I like what you said about the government, kind of like they're the kind of the off the books black ops.
Black Ops, thank you. That's what I
Yeah,
was looking for.
yeah, kind of site where they're not really subject to any sort of oversight. They're completely privatized, but they're being funded by this corporation, which is a parent corporation of this subsidiary corporation, and like 5 layers up, it's like, oh, it's the defense contractors and then the government, you know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. And I think Jim is very much like that sort of crooked general in a way. And I think a lot of people maybe thought he was, too villainous, but when you watch something like Succession and you see the Brian Cox character, and he seems really cartoonish in a way as well, but that's just how some people are when they're in those seats of power, and their egos are so massive that he refers himself in these kind of godlike ways, and that's very much how he thinks of himself. And yeah, the characters in this book, I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but the characters in this book are all really complicated characters. And most of the characters in a lot of my books, I tend to be very gray in the sense of right and wrong. And also they're all very human. The good guys aren't always nice and the bad guys aren't always mean. And like Beth is a very complicated, complex character, and who can be very abrasive, but very warm, and very cynical, but also very needy in some ways. So I try to make all my characters very human. And sometimes I think that riles readers up a little bit because they kind of expect these certain tropes to fall into line with characters. But for me, I enjoy making the characters complex, and that's more interesting to me as a writer. But anyways, I didn't mean to go off on this.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, talking about the panel that she had to go before to make sure that she was psychologically fit, one of the debriefing events reveals that she traveled back in time to a very horrific moment from her childhood, which I'm, not going to specify. I don't know if that'll create a spoiler or not, but it definitely raises concerns about her mental stability. So I was wondering, like, as quote unquote omniscient as Langan is, did he not like dig into her background, like do a background check, have people, investigate her beforehand?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't really think about that, but I think the reality is that Jim is very greedy. As you find out as the story progresses, Jim sees dollar signs and these inventions. And so I kind of think of Jim as this sort of, he's like this hoarder, a gatherer of these brilliant minds who are doing very experimental, cutting edge work. And I think that's what Langan Corp really is at its heart. It's a kind of a gathered nest of all these different people who have created things that are very like cutting edge and very technology forward, and also very like potentially dangerous. And I think that's the sense that I wanted to give with him. So Beth and Coulson were out of money and they had no way to continue to develop their technology in this machine. So I imagine this day, and I think they even mentioned it briefly in the story. I imagine this day where they're going around pitching this idea to people, trying to get funding. And Jim was sort of this guy who said, I'll fund you, but you work for me now. And that was kind of the decision that they made to keep going. So I really don't think Jim cared all that much about whether Beth, had a damaged childhood or whether she was emotionally stable or psychologically stable. I think all he saw was the technology and the machine and what he could do with it. And I think you could even go so far as to say maybe that's why there are so many doctors and psychologists surrounding Beth, because he set it up to make sure that she stays sane and able-bodied, because he needs that technology. And it would be a spoiler to go too far into it, but he does have his own agenda as well, which I think plays into, why he brings in these almost damaged goods people, because like Jerry in a way is similar. You kind of get the sense that Jerry's not all there, like,
Yeah.
and he's pretty paranoid and all that stuff. So whether it's rightly so or not. And so I think Jim's ultimate goal is to kind of find these cutting edge technologies, these brilliant scientific minds, and then basically buy them and bring them into his parlor, as it were, this Langan Corp, this, brutalist dystopian building on top of a hill where it always seems to be raining and gray, right? Behind fences and armed guards and all that kind of stuff. So, and it's like a bunker, you mentioned it. Yeah, it's like most of the corporation is underground. And I have actually I've been to laboratories in my past. When I was a location manager for film and TV, I went to a place that was very similar to Langan Corp, where there was all these underground levels, and they did
That's terrifying.
it was very cool, actually, because I'd never really known that really existed, and I based a lot of Langan Corp really on this place that I had spent some time shooting a film, and there was restricted areas you couldn't go into, and yeah, so it was really interesting. So, but yeah, I don't think he cares about Beth other than, can she get me the technology I need so that I can basically do what I want with it and monetize it in the way that I want to monetize it.
Yeah. Well, this scene with the panel and subsequent glimpse into this horrific event highlights the fact that Beth and her late husband Coulson did not understand the machine's process for choosing an arrival point. So was the lack of understanding on their part meant to add to the sense of danger, or was it more about the limits of human control over technology?
I would say both. I definitely wanted to get across the idea that while Beth is very smart and brilliant and has created this amazing technology, she's also ignorant of a lot of how it works. And I think it's one of those, the dangers of science, stories or tropes. But I definitely wanted to feel like Beth was being punished by a greater force, an unknown force, for kind of, I kind of think of it as her machine as sort of like this Tower of Babel, from the Bible. And the idea that while she's trying to get this amazing new technology off the ground, at the same time there's something sort of pushing back against her, something very vast and great and unknowable. And so that was definitely one of the themes of the book, was that the universe in this story is a character in a way, and has an impact on the why and how things progress. And also, to your point, that's kind of what ends up becoming the driving plot point, I guess, with the story, is before Jim can fully take over this technology, he needs Beth to understand and to figure out why the machine is doing the things that it's doing. And not in the sense of how it works, but in the sense of why she's being sent to the places she's being sent to. And, and it doesn't really make sense given some of the places that Coulson was sent to when he traveled. But if you really read deeply, ultimately those events that are mentioned with Coulson's traveling end up being impactful in a different way. So the idea was to get across that something unknowable was pushing back, and one, and creating more mystery about it, and two, I wanted to get across the fact that as brilliant as she is, there's so much that Beth doesn't fully understand, and the dangers inherent in playing God with things that you don't fully understand, and she ends up being impacted by it.
Well, and I think we've pretty much already addressed this question, speaking of the antagonist, Jim Langan, CEO of Langan Corp. The question was he purely a villain, or were you aiming for a little bit of moral complexity? But it sounds kind of like he was purely a villain.
Well, he's purely a villain, but sometimes when I have a villain, quote unquote, in a story, I also want there to be a general understanding of the motivations of that character. So I think there are obvious motivating factors for why he acts the way he acts. And also the fact that Beth can be abrasive and pushes a lot of Jim's buttons, as it were. I think their constant like friction, I think maybe enhances his villainy more than than maybe it would be if she was a little more amenable to his requests all the time and stuff like that. So, but I definitely get, like, with Beth and Jim, for me, when I was writing it, I kind of see them as like father-daughter who don't get along, but sort of need each other. And that was my thinking when writing a lot of their scenes, was this sort of like, they're almost like a father-daughter relationship, but not in the traditional sense where like they're lovey-dovey and stuff like that, but in the sense that like he's very much a parental figure driving her. It's almost like when you see these young prodigies who have the parents who are like pushing them to study harder or to go to college when they're 13, or athletes push them harder and harder to get better so they can become professionals, even if it's not what the kid necessarily wants or whatever. I sort of saw that as like part of the Jim Beth dynamic, was that he was pushing her as a parent might push a prodigy, and she was resisting that. And the way she treated him was very much like how a young child might snap back at a parent. And so I kind of really enjoyed their friction of their relationship. And I thought personally, when as a writer, I thought it was very realistic, given their personalities, how those moments would happen. And also the fact is, like I said, they're sort of stuck with each other, right? Like she needs him and he needs her. And so they put up with a lot from each other, which I thought was very interesting to write about.
Well, was there a specific moment where you wanted the reader to truly feel the weight of his power or influence?
Yeah, I think later in the book, there is a sort of reveal as to just how much Jim knows or doesn't know. And I think that was kind of the moment where I wanted the reader to know, like, that there was maybe more to this than meets the eye, so to speak. But even early on, there's a moment when Beth has a particularly difficult trip and Jim's there with like the board members and stuff. And as they're sort of watching her have a complete breakdown, Jim sort of turns and smiles to the board and says, I give you time travel, in a sort of like a showman way. And that to me was the moment when it was like, Jim doesn't care about her. Jim is in complete control here. And where his loyalties lie are with these board members. He's the only one who's not running down to check on Beth. He's the one who's turning to the suits and saying, ladies and gentlemen, I give you time travel. So that was for me a big moment in his character arc.
Is it bad that I found that comical when he said that? I don't know
No,
why. It's just like,
no, I actually, no, I love that moment, and I hope I didn't spoil it for readers, but I love that moment. And a lot of the editors and stuff who read the book early would like highlight that moment with like a big laughing emoji or something, and just being like, it's just kind of one of those very cinematic moments. Anytime a tyrant shows a little charm, I think there's almost like a relief valve that's kind of twisted for the reader. And so yeah, Jim in a lot of ways is sort of this, he's a charming guy in some ways, but he's also obviously like this tyrant. So, but I'm glad you laughed at that moment, because for me, it was sort of like almost like a darkly comic moment in the book. One of very few darkly comic moments. It's a pretty serious book, but that is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, he's a tyrant, but he's also a businessman. He's got to be a little seductive.
Right, exactly right.
Well, Langan shocks her when he informs her that a reporter will be joining her in the lab to interview her about the project, regardless of how classified it is. The reporter will have to sign an NDA and will only be given access to surface-level aspects of the project, but the main reason for the visit is to generate interest from potential investors as the product needs more funding to continue. So does this moment reflect a larger theme in the book, like the clash between science and business, or integrity versus profit?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the thing, is he's forcing this reporter down Beth's throat because he needs funding. He needs to drum up more funding. And the only way to drum up more funding in his mind is to kind of go public with the machine, or at least broad strokes of what the machine does. And Beth doesn't feel like the machine is ready to go public because there's still so much she doesn't understand about how it works and all that sort of stuff. And so it also starts the ticking clock of the story, because from that point on, that Beth only has a certain amount of time to figure this thing out, because Jim is putting a lot of pressure on her, basically saying, look, you either figure it out or you're done, and I'll bring someone else in who can figure it out. And I think that reporter being interjected into the story is the beginning of that. So yes, it's definitely that moment where science and profit have their first initial clash. And that's kind of gets the ball rolling for the rest of the story.
Yeah, and I'm trying to look up the particular book, and I just lost it. The reporter, can you tell me her name again? I forget.
Chio Nakata, I believe is
Yes.
her name. Yeah.
She, much like a character in Ronald Malfi's book Senseless, and I'm trying to find.
Well, I just read Senseless.
Yeah, what was the son's name?
Oh, I don't remember the name. I remember the son.
Yeah. Yeah, Landon. Yeah. So her and Landon are both written in such a specific way. I mean, all your characters are great, but that one and Malfi's Landon in particular, I feel like are written in a way where there's like, at least to me subjectively, there's only one way to perceive them. The way you describe her facial expressions, how she never gets offended, the warm smile she puts on, the poise she sits with, and the same thing with his character Landon. I don't know what it is, but it's like there's only one way to interpret it. Like I feel like the same way I interpret it would be the same way 9 other people would, because it's just so specific and so it just really kind of penetrates your brain. Did you find anything different about her as you were writing her? Just the way she came to you?
No, I don't, not really. When I think of characters, I don't really think necessarily what they look like or their ethnicity or anything like that. It's more about what kind of personalities they have. And then the rest is kind of like fills in the blanks. I'll fill in themselves. I don't really overthink about stuff too much. So with Chio, it was very much like I knew she was young. I knew she was incredibly smart and savvy. I tried not to go down the trope of like the hungry reporter thing. I really wanted to give her a little more sophistication than that, and also be kind of conversational and not be so stoic than maybe some reporters might be. So I tried to inject her with like some personality. But yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the way she sits. Like I had, like in Beth's office, there's a chair that she jokingly refers to as the most uncomfortable chair in the world because she never wants anybody to sit in her office for too long.
Yeah.
So she purposely has this uncomfortable chair. So, and the fact that Chio seemed like totally at ease in it was kind of like a telling moment about her character and about what kind of person she, physically, viscerally, for the reader, what kind of person she was. And there's even a moment with Chio later in the story, and I won't spoil it for anyone, but so much of the story is Beth giving Chio all this information. And then kind of one of the key moments of the book is a piece of information that Chio gives Beth. I like that she ended up having a bigger role in Beth's arc than just being like this kind of trope reporter who shows up so that the reader has the information they need. I really wanted her to have a bigger, more agency within the story and the way the story turns out. But no, she came to me fully formed, much like Tariq and Jonathan and Jim. And, with Mike, for me, when I come up with an idea for a story, one of the first things that alerts me that this story has legs and could maybe be something bigger is if characters start sort of popping out of this idea and kind of showing up in my head and saying stuff and doing stuff. And if the characters don't start popping out of the idea, then I usually know the idea is maybe a little too, not something that my subconscious brain is excited about. But so I think with Third Rule of Time Travel, a lot of these characters just kind of arrived fully formed and ready to go. And so Chia was one of them. But no, nothing other than that, nothing really different than Beth or anyone else.
Gotcha. Well, there is a stark contrast between Beth's interactions at work within a cutthroat industry that demands quick results from careful experimentation and her home life, where she returns to an adorable daughter and a matronly nanny. So, did you intend for the contrast between her professional and personal worlds to create tension, or to offer her and the reader a place of emotional refuge?
Yeah, it's very accurate. And I think for me, it was about giving Beth's character depth. Like I was very aware that Beth has a very brittle personality at work with her coworkers and with her boss. And she's much more confrontational, and she's, sometimes even snarky. And, she has a kind of this, it's almost like these defense mechanisms that she uses in order to protect herself. And at home, she doesn't have to protect herself anymore. With her daughter, she can let all those defenses go down. And so that it was very much supposed to be that this is a safe place that's filled with nothing but love and trust. And Beth is a completely different person when she's in that space than when she's fighting for her life, almost quite literally, at her job. And it's a good question because it's very much something that is accurate as far as Beth's character is concerned. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do with her arc was to kind of start when her home world and her job world begin to sort of collide and infuse into each other. That's really when she kind of starts going off the rails a little bit. But it's also, I think, when she begins to discover things about herself that come into play for the remainder of the story. And that's kind of one of the things about her character, is that where these two worlds are separate, she's very driven and very focused on one thing. And then when they collide and sort of start merging, she has to kind of decide in a way what's most important. And so that to me was one of the key things with her character, was kind of coming to that decision and then acting on it.
Gotcha. Well, the idea of reliving moments of one's life feels inherently introspective. Did writing this story prompt you to reflect on your own past? And if so, how did that affect the book?
I wouldn't want to say a hard no or a hard yes. I wrote this book, I think, almost 3 years ago now. And I think when I first wrote it, it's hard to say whether or not I was thinking about my own personal past or anything. Certainly nothing in the book has anything to do with my life, that's for sure. But as far as just like the idea of reliving something and maybe changing it or maybe not being able to change it, I think it probably entered my mind once or twice. I think there are probably hopefully anyone who reads the book will have those moments where, like, if I go back to this moment in my life that was really changed the trajectory of my life, what would that feel like? And what if I couldn't change it? What if I couldn't do anything? Or, what if I could? And I think that's definitely, you said introspective. And that's kind of one of the things I think that was sort of, I don't want to say it was difficult or a struggle, but that was one of the tricky things about writing this book, is creating a thriller where it is very introspective. It is very psychological. I mean, a lot of the action takes place in Beth's mind, and it was tricky to make a more traditional thriller out of something that was so, introspective or internalized. And it was a fun challenge to do that. I think on some levels I succeeded. I'm sure to some folks, maybe I didn't. That was my intention, was to create a thriller that was very much about emotion and about the psychological effects of reliving your past. So like I said, I'm sure I did have those moments, but they weren't powerful enough for me to kind of recall. I don't think they impacted the book or the story in any way, other than probably I'm sure I had some reflective moments of my own past. I think anytime you see an idea like this, it's impossible not to think about it. So I'm sure I did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in this story, reality is in constant flux. How did you keep all of it cohesive for the reader? Because I think as the writer, I'd get lost myself sometimes. Like, wait a minute, what thread of reality are we on here?
Yeah.
Are you like a meticulous outliner, or?
I am a meticulous outliner, yes. And I think with any thriller, especially with a thriller, I think you have to know where you're going. I think to do it, and I shouldn't say that because I'm sure there are a lot of writers who can do it just fine without maybe laying it all out ahead of time, but I like to have it all laid out ahead of time. And I had certain scenes that were already locked in my head that I knew I had to get to. And so a lot of it was filling in the blanks between those scenes and how did they get to this point. But there are a lot of things going on in this book that are sort of subtle and some not so subtle. And I think it wasn't hard for me to keep it organized, I guess, or cohesive, because I don't know, I could see the whole thing pretty clearly. Sometimes I can't, but in this book, this story, I felt like I could see everything pretty clearly, and I kind of knew where they were and what was happening. There were some moments that happened later in the story that feel very speculative and almost supernatural, but in my mind, they're actually very scientific. One of the quantum mechanic themes that run throughout the story is the idea that time, like changing reality, it wasn't like turning a page. It was sort of like a wave coming in on the beach. and slowly coming in and then sort of slowly going back out, right? And to me, that was how shifting reality acted. And threads, not particles. And so I kind of liked the idea, and I play with it a little bit in the story, where Beth is sort of experiencing one of these incoming and outgoing waves. So realities are sort of layering on top of one another and intermingling in ways that the human mind can't really comprehend. That was sort of an interesting thing to play with as a device. But anyway, yeah, I'm not sure I answered the question fully, but that was definitely a big part of trying to keep track of. It was less keeping track of details and events, and more, I think, about making sure that everything I did was explainable in a very real, grounded way. And that was really the thing I had to kind of like make sure I was organized about. I try not to over explain, but I also try and make it, the way I wrote the book is that I wanted to give enough science for people who are reading it as a thriller so that they get it. And they're like, okay, got it. Moving on. And now I know why this is happening or why this is happening. But I also wanted to give enough science so that people who maybe were more inclined to dig deeper into the science aspects of it could also find some fulfillment there as well. Like you could go down 2 or 3 levels of detail and still be like, oh, okay, I understand in micro detail why this is happening versus, maybe just staying on the macro surface. This is very much a book that, while it's written in a way that is purposely simplistic, meaning I really wanted it to be story, 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 because there's already a lot to think about. I didn't want to get too bogged down in prose or in characterization so much. And I really wanted it to be like skating over thin ice, But one of the things about this book that was interesting to me as a writer, and maybe this was also something that was difficult to keep track of, is there was a few layers to this story. And in addition to the 2 I just mentioned, sort of the hard science versus thriller layers, there's also a whole layer about that sort of goes unspoken about Coulson's character. Coulson is her husband who dies. That's not a spoiler, from the beginning of the book that he's dead. But the way his story that's taking place sort of just beneath Beth's story, and the 2 kind of keep bumping into each other a little bit, but there's this whole story going on that reader can't see that's going on the whole time Beth's story is going on. So I think if you would enjoy the book enough and you cared enough to reread it, I think it would be fun to kind of reread and see, like, once you get to the ending and you kind of know the end, I would hope that it would be fascinating to go back and reread it through, knowing what you know at the end of the book. But I think that's asking a lot of the reader. But I think if you're into it enough and you want it and you like the story enough and you want to know those different layers, they're there. And if you don't, if you want to read as a thriller and you're good and you're going to move on to the next one, that's okay too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of that science and the things going on in the background, this is the part I really wanted to get to. Was in the afterword, you state that the time machine was inspired by the work and ideas of Michio Kaku and Kip Thorne. And I'm familiar with Michio Kaku. I've seen him on a lot of podcasts, but I'm not familiar with Kip Thorne. What do their ideas kind of have in common?
Kip Thorne, he actually teaches here in Los Angeles, and he was a big part of Interstellar. The Christopher Nolan movie.
Okay.
Yeah. He was the one, he was kind of the consultant, the physics consultant, if you will, or the science, science consultant for Interstellar. So, and it should be noted in no way, shape, or form, I don't want these guys taking the blame for my layman science, but I was definitely very much inspired by some of the ideas of Kaku. And I would say this, the machine, the mechanics of the engineering of the machine itself was very much inspired by Kip Thorne. Some of the ideas were very much inspired by Kaku. And then, also elements of, I read a lot of Brian Greene, and I read a lot of layman science books, and I find a lot of the ideas fascinating. And for those who might be interested, Michio Kaku wrote a book called, and now that I brought it up, I can't remember the title, but
let's see. Maybe we'll.
Oh yeah, if you can Google it, I'm sure.
The God Equation.
No, it's older than that. It's probably like a decade old now.
Physics of the Impossible.
Physics of the Impossible.
Okay.
And is there one called like Parallel something? Parallel. Or no, I think it's physics of the
Parallel
impossible.
worlds. Parallel
Parallel
worlds.
worlds. There,
Yeah.
thank you. So parallel worlds is actually the one that inspired some of the ideas in the book. And I also mentioned this in the afterword. One of the things about the story that I was trying to figure out was whether or not a wormhole could sustain, data being sent through it. And I knew that a wormhole couldn't sustain any sort of mass going through it. A single particle would collapse it. And you can't have any matter going through a wormhole, no matter what anybody says, even speculatively, even theoretically. So I think one of the things when I was thinking about this idea was like, I wonder if the wormhole would collapse if you sent data through it. And once you were able to create this wormhole, if you sent data, would it collapse? And how long could it be sustained for, using an impossible power source such as negative energy, which to date cannot be harnessed, but they're working on it. Just like quantum computers are working on it. These are all things that are in the book. Anyway, so you mentioned Kaku does a lot of podcasts. So I was watching one of his podcasts. It was a Q&A. And at the end of the Q&A with the moderator, they open it up to the public and you could ask questions. And so you could type in your question. And so I typed in the question, if you were able to open a wormhole and send data, raw data through the wormhole, would the wormhole collapse or would it sustain that data being sent through it? And so they asked the question live to Kaku, and he said he kind of thought about it for a second. He said yes, it would work. And so I was very excited about that because it's sort of a key element of my story. And if he said no, that wouldn't work for whatever reason, I would have probably ditched the story altogether because without that I can't really have my time machine. So that was cool, and it was fun to have, in some small way, him kind of justify to a degree this one kind of fictional element of my time machine. And I try and get this across in the back of the book without necessarily overdoing it, but I really wanted to get across the idea that, like, this is ultimately a work of fiction. I am not a scientist, and I didn't go to college, but I also tried my very, very best to make it as grounded in reality, the reality as far as it pertains to theoretical physics and quantum mechanics, as possible. And I think I accomplished that. I actually was very fortunate to work with a consultant on the story, Les Johnson, who works for NASA, and he actually read the book, blurbed it for me, which was very kind, and also gave me some feedback on some of the more technical aspects and the more scientific aspects of the time machine, as well as the question and answer device using the remote satellite, and a lot of those things. So it was really great to have his input. But ultimately, it's a work of fiction written by a genre writer. But just like with anything, even with like historical fiction, I always work really hard to do my best to get it right. So those readers out there who are big fact checkers, they're satisfied to some degree. But then the readers who just want to have fun with it, they're satisfied as well.
You should send a copy to Kaku.
Yeah, I would love that. I would love to have sent him one and gotten a blurb. That would have been life changing. But
yeah, wow.
I think my editor reached out and no dice. I'm sure he gets a lot of requests.
Yeah. Well, do you believe in universal consciousness, panpsychism, or maybe something akin to the Stoic concept of the Logos? The reason I ask is because of the duality between Beth and Coulson as far as their beliefs.
Oh, yeah. Beth is sort of like half mocks Coulson a little bit because Coulson is the much more spiritual, we'll call it, of the two. Beth is much more fact-based, pragmatic. And that plays into the story and also plays into what happens with those two characters. But yes, I do believe in universal consciousness. I do. And like I said earlier, in this book, I definitely think of the universe as being a character, one that cares about what Beth is doing and who's paying attention to what Beth is doing. And, she's kind of got the universe's attention in a way, and not in a good way.
Yeah, you are really starting to piss me off.
yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, you guys are really going to bug me. And so, yes, I do think that. I think we all think and I say we, I mean, generally as humanity, we all think we're so smart. And we think we know so much. And we have these satellites and we have these telescopes and we have all this stuff. And we have these brilliant scientific minds. But even the most brilliant scientific mind in the world would admit that they know a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what the universe even is, or how the universe came to be. Yes, we can go back to the Big Bang and we can explore it until our eyes fall out of our head and do all the math that we want to do. But if you go back even 1 second before, and they always talk about, whenever you talk about people with the Big Bang describing the beginning of the universe, they kind of like always sort of like leave out the part about, right, but what was all this energy? Like everyone starts with like, oh, well, there was all this energy. And then all this energy became this concentrated thing, which blew up and became the universe. It's like, okay, but so where did the energy come from? And what does that look like? Where is this energy? You know what I mean? The idea that we know nothing about what the universe even is. All we know is we are this pale blue dot. We are this tiny speck. We are nothing compared to the vastness of the universe. But for me, what really gets my head spinning is like, yeah, but what really is this energy that created the universe? And I think to think of that, I mean, obviously you have the religious answer, which isn't really a real answer, and you have the scientific answer, which isn't really a real answer because nobody really knows. But what I do think about is that I do think there had to be some energy. Even scientists will say there had to be some energy to make this moment happen. But okay, so what is that energy? And is it alive? Is it thinking? Is it conscious? And I think it is. But that's my personal take. I don't know how you could say it wasn't, in the sense that like energy has to originate from somewhere. So where does it originate from? I don't know. Nobody knows. But it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this may produce spoilers, so feel free to pass. I was just curious to know, Les Johnson was kind of like a technical advisor, right?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that. He helped me, I would say, because I'm sure he would be like, no, dude, I didn't.
I didn't tell you to say that.
Right. I wouldn't want to exaggerate his role in the book. He did read the book and he did offer some feedback. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll use the word feedback. If it won't produce any spoilers, what are some things or a thing that he gave you feedback on?
I think the thing that we talked the most about was, interestingly, wasn't even the time machine itself. It was the question and answer rules. And what happens in the book is, before Beth travels, she's asked 6 questions that are not ambiguous questions. They have like very hard answers. Who's the president kind of stuff? Who's your 2 closest relatives? This kind of thing. There's some ambiguity with like, how would you describe your childhood in 1 word? And she always says happy, which is interesting. But the idea is that these questions are sent at the speed of light to a satellite far enough away and then beamed back at the speed of light. So that by the time they get back to Earth, they're actually behind the timeline of the present. They're actually arrive in the past. And the reason that's important is because after Beth travels, they ask the same 6 questions. And then they replay over like speakers in this room. They replay the answers that she gave before she traveled. And if those answers don't match, for Beth, it was always about, well, if those answers don't match, that means we did something to reality. We've changed the present. The Langan Court perspective, they're asking those questions to make sure that Beth isn't crazy, that Beth isn't losing her marbles and losing touch of reality. So that was interesting. So he helped me out a little bit with that. And then the other thing that was great was he brought up the idea of the inverted square law. Because one of the things that a lot of time travel books don't get into, or the butterfly effect kind of thing that we'll say, which is that, okay, let's say you go back in time and you step on a butterfly, and then when you come back to the present, everybody is blue or whatever. The question is, okay, so you've affected time. You've affected reality. It's obvious that you've affected reality because everybody's blue. But what about the reality of what's on the moon? What about the reality of what's in the next galaxy? What about the reality of what's a million light years away? Like, what's the real impact of changing reality, of changing the timeline? And one of the things that I wanted to address in this book, again, keeping things very grounded and very real as possible, is that I wanted to be very clear that only what was happening on Earth was being affected. And there actually is an inverse square law, actually is a rule of physics where a source of energy, once enacted, the further you get from that source, the ripples, if you will, and I'm not a science guy, but understand the basics here. As those ripples move away from that source, they get weaker and weaker and weaker to the point where they just become nothing. And so that was the idea with what Beth was doing on Earth, was she was affecting her own reality. And then as those ripples grew weaker, they became ineffective as the further away they got from the planet and from Beth. So that was kind of a fun thing to kind of interject into the story to give it. Because I was like, again, it was me really wanting to keep everything very much focused on what was happening with these characters in this place. And also I liked exploring things that aren't always explored with time travel stories. I like the idea of, explaining a little bit more about, even, in the interview, the fictional interview that Beth does with Chio, she's like, so the little green men on Mars aren't affected by what you do here. And, that was kind of one of the reasons I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit in the book. And that was sort of probably the nerd in me wanting to kind of interject that stuff into the story. But it was one of the things that Les Johnson was very helpful with, and explaining and kind of getting some hard science behind the whys of it.
Gotcha. Well, what is the life of Philip Fracassi like outside of writing?
Man, that's a short answer. I probably am a little too one-dimensional. Yeah, I work a lot. I write. I mean, I'm writing all the time. I'm a full-time writer, so lucky enough to be a full-time writer. So I'm at my desk, 7 days a week, usually 10 to 12 hours of time put in. I try and get to the gym twice a week so I don't fall over dead from a heart attack when I turn 60. And but yeah, no, I write and I read and I hang out with my family, and that's about it. I don't do a lot of traveling. I don't really have a lot of hobbies or anything like that. I'm pretty much just love writing and love reading, and that's kind of, I'm cool with that being my life, So there also is some elements, being a writer, if you have some moderate success where a book comes out with like a bigger publisher, sometimes I'll go do like some tour dates, or I'll go meet readers in different parts of the country or in different parts of the world. And like last year or 2 years ago, I went to the UK for about a month and met a lot of my UK readers, which was fun. And this year I'm going to Spain as a guest of honor for this literary festival in Spain. So I get to meet a lot of my Spanish readers because I have a lot of books in Spanish, been translated into Spanish, and I got a pretty kind of a decent following there. So in Spain, so that'll be fun. So I do everything, it feels like, is kind of writing related, even when it's travel and stuff like that. But that's just my life. I mean, it's one of those things where I think, ever since I was a kid, all I ever wanted to be was a writer. And I've had a lot of different jobs, and I've had a lot of different lives. I've owned a bookstore. I've worked in the music industry. I've worked in the film and TV industry, and I've been a security guard, and I've been, a telemarketer and all this other stuff. So I think when I finally got to a point where, okay, I'm a writer, I'm a published professional writer, and this is what I do for a living, I live in kind of a constant state of anxiety and fear of losing that. So I think it really drives me. This last decade, I've been writing professionally. That was first published in 2015. So it's been a decade of me really driving myself and pushing myself so that I can keep doing what I love. So yeah, it's kind of become my life. Sometimes I try and take a day off. I'll try and take a Sunday off. During the football season, I have to take Sundays off because my Lions are playing. But because I'm from Detroit, even though I live in LA for 30 years. But so yeah, I'm a big football fan, I guess, of one answer. But yeah, for the most part, I just love writing and reading and having this be my life. Yeah, I'm totally cool with that.
Awesome. Well, Philip, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks, Vince. Yeah, this has been fun. I appreciate it. It's a lot of time. I enjoy talking about the book. And so I think, thanks for having me on your channel. It's great.
Absolutely. Well, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug, reiterate, or let your readers know about?
Oh, yeah. I would love to plug some stuff. Yeah. So Third Wheel of Time Travel, you can obviously buy now in the UK or the US. We're working on translations for Spain and I think Hungary and I think Germany and maybe one other. But so hopefully some other folks will get to read the story. And then in May, I have a little novella coming out from Shortwave Publishing called D7, which is a horror story about a haunted jukebox. So you can pre-order that now through Shortwave's website or from Amazon or whoever you buy books from. And then September of this year, I have a book coming out from Tor Nightfire called The Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre, which is a slasher horror novel that takes place in a retirement home. And that is available for pre-order right now from anywhere you buy books. And then next year, in April of 2026, I'll have a novel come out called Serafina from Clash Books. And then hopefully at the end of next year, I will come out with a sequel to my novel Gothic, which is a horror novel. So yeah, lots of stuff coming up. As far as what you can get now, all my other books are available, but you can definitely pre-order D7 or the Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre. So those are my current projects. Oh, and I would also say, just for fun, hopefully, I can't confirm it yet, but hopefully A24 made a movie based on one of my short stories called Alter. And the movie's been filmed. We filmed it last year in Canada. And hopefully that's coming out later this year. So keep an eye out for Alter. That's based on one of my horror stories. Yeah. So from A24.
TAR or TER?
ALTAR.
AR. Okay.
Like the thing you sacrifice people on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Very
That's
dark.
Awesome. Well, sounds good. Listeners at home, both live and on demand, all links are in the description. And Philip, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, Vince. I appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest authors and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.